Angela Penagos. She is the director of the Colombian office and principal researcher at RIMIS. RIMIS is the Latin American Center for Rural Development in all the continent. She is an economist with a master's degree in environmental economics and natural resources from Andes University, and she has a PhD from a joint program with this university and Maryland University. She has extensive experience in the design and assessment of public policies on rural and agricultural development, with emphasis on designing policy tools with a territorial approach. As the Director of Rural Development Unit in National Planning Department of Colombian government, she introduced changes incorporating the concept of rurality and territory in the design of public offices. In that context, she coordinated a rural mission, and this mission was a mandate of the Colombian government to have strong technical and political recommendations during the negotiation process of the peace agreement. Once appointed as director of RIMIS Colombia, she has given support to the government in the design of policies and instruments for the implementation of the rural transformation in the post-conflict context, using the strong capacity and results of RIMIS in Latin America. Currently, she is coordinating the Transforming Territories project, a regional project that covers Chile, Mexico, and Colombia, and sponsored by IDRC Canada. Dr. Penagos has extensively published books, peer-reviewed papers, and policymakers that are addressed to different audiences in Latin America and the world. Welcome, Dr. Penagos.
Okay, good morning and good afternoon. Here in Colombia, we are fine ending the morning. First, I would say, Sylvia, that I'm not a PhD for the moment. I just have the master's degree in environmental economics and natural resources from the joint program with Andes University and Maryland. And thanks for this presentation. It is an honor for me to be here and to talk about our findings and our analysis about rural development, territorial development, and probably to talk about how this approach is important for the peace agreement in Colombia. And we are working on that. We are in a very complicated situation now, but I think that the outcomes of a peace process, like in Colombia after 50 years of war, we need to have some patience and to be there, paying attention to rural situation and all the things that are happening at this moment. So thanks, Sarah, also. I am very, very happy to be here. I will share my presentation. If you have any question, please do it. I apologize by my English. I hope I will try to speak very slowly. And if you want that you need that I precise some concept, please just request it. I will share. Okay, first of all, I will explain in a Latin American context with some focus in Colombia in terms of findings and indicators. So the transformation of the rural territories, it is a challenge for Latin American institutions. So I will start why territory matters, a brief look of territorial inequality in Latin America, then rural transformation and rural-urban links as a window of opportunity to reduce territorial inequality, then a brief look about how are the conditions of excluded groups, particularly women and young people, and some final insights. So, in terms of why territory matters. Territorial inequalities can hamper economic growth and favor the emergence of social and political issues. The conditions of the territory determine in some way the trajectories and aspirations of the people who inhabit them. And that's particular for Colombia, but also in other countries like Peru, Chile, that the territories are scenarios where opposing interests converge and can give rise to conflict, which must be properly managed. It is also to understand, or we want to understand that in terms of that conflicts, that many of these conflicts are not only related to natural resources, but also in terms of territorial control, interculturality, and collective property of land in some of our countries, particularly, for example, the case of Argentina and also in Colombia. Why do you need to pay attention of the territories? According to some research and some findings, it can explain about 30% of inequality and limits the possibility for inclusive growth. We know that, for example, many of the policies and instruments in our countries are focused only in the individual characteristic and individual households. But we know, according to our findings, that the territorial characteristics and individual characteristics interact and determine in some way the trajectories and the opportunities that a person could have in a rural zone. It goes beyond the difference between individuals and households, and it implies difference between territories. And it's also related to political and social conflicts and the presence of weak institutions. That is particular in the case of Latin America, because the weak institutions are located mostly in the rural zones. One point, facing poverty requires that countries become concerned about rural problems. The big issue here is that, as in all the countries, today we find that around 80% of the population live in urban areas. And this has been changing from 1950, and we can see that in Latin America this is a typical behavior, but that is a big picture. No, we are looking at in terms of the traditional numbers and indicators that urban and rural zones. But we know that this kind of behavior is not the reality. We have strong connections, and we have small towns that have characteristics and conditions like a rural zone. But even the strong efforts that made Latin America in reducing poverty, the situation in rural zones are not so good. And in the last years, we can see that we are increasing the poverty. The poor in these zones are increasing, and some big results of the beginning of the 2000s are stopping now, and this is a big problem in Latin America. And with this issue with the COVID, it could be more powerful. Now, in terms of this, I want to show this problem of rural poverty in terms of country. In all the countries, not in Uruguay, we can find that rural zones are poorer than urban zones. In some cases, this situation is very complicated. For example, in Bolivia, we found that almost 60% of the population of rural zones are poor, but the situation is still complicated in Colombia, Ecuador, and also in Peru. one issue. 80% of the poor people in Latin America live in territory with ecological importance. That is very, very important because these people in some way are marginalized and are located in zones with this ecological importance. And through this position or this condition, we could lose biodiversity and promote some kind of deforestation because these people don't have enough opportunity to have good incomes and opportunities in terms of labor markets. So how can we see inequality in our countries? Remis made important research at the beginning of the 2000s. We learned about 10 countries in Latin America, trying to understand what kind of territory or what condition of territories provoked that in some way people have better income, experience poverty reduction and a better income distribution. And we found at the end that only 10% of the population in Latin America live in municipalities that have experienced a history of positive changes. And 30% of the population live in municipalities that have not experienced any favorable change in these three variables. That explains that many people in Latin America live in territories with any opportunity to have better conditions and reduce poverty. And this is a big picture how the inequality, the territorial inequality is a concern topic in terms of policies challenges. And more recently, in Remis, we made a study trying to understand how is the achievement of social development goals in terms of territory. We know that Latin America and countries like Colombia, Chile have good results in terms of SDGs, in terms of this agenda. But when we saw how is the behavior of the SDG achievements across the territory within the countries, we found a strong difference. And this index tried to show that, and we found that Mexico, Guatemala, and Colombia, as you can see, this light green shows the worst condition, are in the worst situation in terms of SDG achievements. That means that many territories inside this country don't have any result in terms of 30 agenda. And it's implied that the focus of the policies and the institutional capacity of our countries are concentrated in few municipalities or in few territories. And these territories in the majority, in the most of the cases, are the big cities like Bogota, Medellin, Santiago de Chile, that have the capacity to transform the context. But we have a tremendous or a big challenge around the other territories in our countries. So, why do we need to address territorial inequality? Because it is a strong externality that can affect the option of social and economic inclusion, provoke or promote migration and loss of economic and social dynamics. These territories face deforestation and loss of biodiversity. And as you have seen, it could provoke economic and political instability, as you see recent political unrest in Ecuador, Chile, and Colombia. And I want to say that this social mobilization in our countries is an expression of the people that the commitment, the promise of economic development is not equally distributed across people and territories. And that is the big issue now in our policy challenges and also in terms of research, because I think we don't have a strong answer for territorial inequality. The instruments and the political decisions are focusing in individuals and households, but we need to work also in territorial conditions, and how to work on that is probably the big question here, because our institutions are very, very weak. We don't have the capacity to transform these territories very quickly. We need time, we need to recognize the people that live that and work in a way of citizenship. And that is particularly very important in the case of Colombia, because we were in a war, in a conflict better, for almost 50 years. And many of these people and these zones or this territory are not recognized as Colombian people, no? Because the state never has been there. We need to work on that, and therefore we need to create knowledge and to I don't know how to say it, to advance in practical solutions and for these territories. And in that context, we found that probably an opportunity, a window opportunity to work on that. First of all, the rural transformation, and in the framework of the rural transformation, rural-urban links as could be an option to integrate the isolated zones to the social and economic development. First, what are rural-urban linkages or rural-urban links? They refer to the complementary flows of people, natural resources, capital goods, and information between rural, peri-urban, and urban areas. That is the definition of Habitat Third in 2016. And that is very important because United Nations and all these international organisms recognize these interactions, and that these interactions are important to inclusion and to development. And I should say that we were in a framework before that consider that the best results in terms of social inclusion and reduce inequality and reduce poverty probably could be the agglomeration. But we are finding in our recent research, at least in the case of Latin America, that the promise of agglomeration is not working well. We have big cities with a big poverty, with a cluster of poverty inside the cities, and we don't have the capacity to tackle to face this situation, and therefore we need to look again to rural zones as an opportunity for that. So why are important rural-urban linkages? We have evidence that urban-rural linkages, especially around intermediate cities and towns, can reduce poverty faster than the agglomeration economies of mega cities. And I think that is a discussion now in terms of agglomeration and rural development. But why we found that evidence? Because shorter distance to migrate access and services market. The people, particularly the women, have a more opportunity to involve in market labor and access to education. What that we call consumer links, urban-rural remittance, and we have higher compatibility with their human capital, unqualified, semi-qualified versus qualified. If the people are isolated and don't have the options to access to education, this gap will be bigger. So with the urban-rural linkages and to understand how is the behavior, it could be an option to have people more educated and probably to go beyond agricultural labor market and other activities in rural zones that could offer better income. And I will say again, particularly that is important for women and young people. And then, and what are the areas that we can focus our analysis and policy instruments to take an advantage of this rural transformation? Labor markets. We know that labor markets are changing in rural zones. Urbanization patterns, particularly small and medium cities, are playing a big role in our countries, and the agri-food systems that have a strong importance now in terms of the situation of the pandemic and the needs to have food in small towns and with more connections. First, how is changing the labor market in Latin America? We can see, I'm so sorry because here it's in Spanish, but I would say that in English. For example, in 2001, 66% of the employments in agricultural zones were from agriculture. Now we are saying that is only in 2018, almost 55%. And other activities are emerging in rural zones as commerce here, manufacture, and other services that are related to tourism, other type of exploitations in rural zones. So the changes that probably in Europe or in the United States or even in Canada happened probably 30 years ago are happening now in Latin America, in some countries with more power, but in general terms, we can see that rural zones have new activities, rural zones are changes, that's what we call the rural transformation. And urban patterns. This is the map of Colombia. And I want to show that even we have big cities, these green spots are, here is Bogota, here is Cali, here is Medellin, here is Medellin, and here is Barranquilla and Cartagena. Probably you know Cartagena. And these are the agglomerations in Colombia. And these other spots here are the lights of other towns that are connected in Colombia. And even we have a strong agglomeration, we also have small and medium towns and intermediate cities that are connected and have relationships. We obviously, as you can see in this map, these are concentrated in the Andean zones. Here are the mountains. But that is an opportunity because many of these small towns have strong connections with agri-food systems, with ecological important zones, and the economic activities are between rural and urban activities. And that is an opportunity for Territorial to face territorial inequality. One thing, I would say that is not about agglomeration versus no agglomerations. And another thing, and that is important to say, that rural and urban are not homogeneous or are isolated, as the statistic and the traditional numbers consider that. And there is a portfolio of places with different levels of access, population density, and economic activities. And the territorial dynamics are not constrained by political administrative limits, as you can see in this map, and nor by the rural and economic dichotomy that are very common in our countries. Okay. So another way to see this transformation is to look or to give how is the behavior of agri-food systems. This is the case also in Colombia. I'm so sorry about that. But we can see that 60% of the agricultural GDP in Colombia is concentrated in these small and medium towns. We said that intermediate cities. And also, in terms of labor productivity, we can see that the average of agricultural the best agricultural labor productivities is also in these intermediate cities here that probably have more connections with rural zones. Another issue is how will change the occupation of the territory in the future. According to UN Habitat, and you can see here Latin America and the Caribbean, in the future, probably we will have more of these small and medium cities. And this pattern is across the world. So it implies that we need to understand the relation between urban and rural zones and the agri-food systems, and all the issues related to the agri-food system and labor market will play a big role in terms of policies, development, economic growth, and obviously in terms of poverty reduction and territorial inequality. So part of the problem is that, and we need to work on that, and therefore the research, and I think that we as researchers, we need to work more on that, is that policies for rural and urban development continue to be disconnected and rarely discussed from an integrated perspective. Perhaps we have more information and we have evidence that the territory and the relation between individual characteristics and territorial characteristic is a reality in our countries and in our reality. The instruments are working in the same way, no? By sectors. We have, for example, in terms of poverty reduction, the instruments are working only in individual characteristics, not the individual and his context. We don't recognize the links between territories, and probably the worst thing here is that many of our policy makers consider that rural is the same as agriculture, and the instruments for rural development are the same instrument that for rural development. So, and how are the condition of women and youth in this context? And I want to say again, our framework, no? We consider that all these things are connected, and we need to have a systemic analysis, because the individual characteristics define the type of trajectory, and the territorial dynamics or territorial characteristic define the shape of the trajectory that a person could have during his life. So it determines economic inclusion and the real opportunities for the people in a country. And it has more importance in the case of women and young people because according to our last findings, women are in a critical situation, particularly they can't take advantage of these links or this rural transformation and are in the worst conditions and don't have the instruments to change the realities. So according to some findings, we can say that the labor participation for men in Latin America in rural urban territories is around 65%, while for women is close to 50%. So definitely women are excluded of labor market. And when the women have a work, they are engaged in low productivity activities. And one issue, and this issue covered more importance during the pandemic, the women are related to unpaid family employment and are in the informal wage sector. What does it mean? That many of the women in Latin America don't have access to health, don't have access to pension, is correct to say that in English, and they are not in a social protection system. And that is very complicated because in the future, many of these women will be in extreme poverty. And in the case of the Colombia, for example, many women or men lost their life in the conflict, and these women are alone with any opportunity in the rural zones. When we see and we work this analysis with the Iberoamericana in Mexico, we wanted to understand in terms of labor participation of women, what conditions are more important, no? We want to see individual characteristics, territorial characteristics, and household characteristics. And this is the first time that we have evidence that the territory matters, nor in the same way as individual or household characteristics, but it has an importance. And for example, in Chile, 10% of the participation, of labor, the participation of women in labor market are explained by territorial conditions. In the case of Colombia, 8.5%, and in the case of Mexico, 11.7%. I think that this is a very, very important finding. And it shows us that it is necessary to work in a systemic way, as I said. Then, in terms of young people, we made the same analysis that I told you and the same index in terms of SDGs, and they to see how are their behavior only for young people. And we found, as you can see in this picture, we found that in terms of young people, they have the same behavior as the SDG. What does it mean? That the young people that live in big cities like Bogotá, Santiago de Chile, are in better conditions or have more achievement in terms of SDGs, and the young people that live in rural zones or more isolated zones don't have any achievement in terms of SDGs. And some final insights to go to the conversation and to some question if you have. Addressing inequality requires that countries dedicate their attention and resource to the rural sphere without falling into simplifications that neglect territorial and social diversity. That implies that governments and their institutions develop policies and instruments that expressly reflect the commitment to institutional arrangement and specific budgets. That is what I said, that we need to work more on that, because it's very complicated to do that, considering the heterogeneity of our countries and the weak capacity of institutions, particularly in rural zones and more isolated territories. In many of the rural territories, there are overlapping interests related to power structure that exclude an important group of its inhabitants from decision-making process, creating spaces for development of activities such illegal mining and illicit crops. And I would say that in Colombia, for example, this is one of the big issues. We want to work on that with Sylvia, because the illicit crops are definitely an economic opportunity for women particularly, and for young people, because this group of population are excluded of traditional labor markets in rural zones, and probably they have there is the only opportunity. The problem with this is, obviously, is a illicit activity, and is linked to other big problems that even are not only in Colombia or in Peru or in Ecuador, that cover probably all the world, and is very, very violent and and dangerous. And there is a positive relationship between the proximity of rural territories to cities and the development of agri-food systems. And I think we need to work on that to understand better how is the behavior of agri-food systems, and how we can do to include small farmers and peasants to these relations, and to have the opportunity to have more income and access to markets. And in urban and rural territories, there are more systematically inclusive growth dynamic, which confirm that the relation between the size of the city and the economic growth is not linear, but it is important. So I hope I on time, because it could be a good idea to have a small conversation. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Angela. That was really, really interesting and informative. There's definitely lots of time for questions. We still have about 15 to 20 minutes there. So I'll open it up to anyone on the line that would like to ask a question. I know I have a few, but I don't need to be the first one.
No questions.
Well, why don't I start?
I hope you understand me.
Oh, absolutely. Your English was fantastic. Okay. Don't worry. So I have a list here, but I'll start maybe with one of the pieces that you ended on, and you mentioned the importance for policy development to address inequality. Is any of that happening right now? Do you see anything, and if it is happening, is there anything specifically related to the gender piece?
Okay. I will talk about Colombia. I'm so sorry, because it's where I have more experience.
Sure.
Yes, it is like all the people, all the policymakers know that we need to work on that, no? And one example of that is the achievements in terms of the peace agreement, no? One of the big issue in the rural reform, that is the first point of our peace agreement, is to tackle the rurality. We call that a territorial approach that involves territorial conditions and individual characteristics. And we have made advancements or we have achievement in terms of plans, but the possibility of implementation is very, very limited because the structure of the government, we are working on sectors and our instruments are for individuals or for households. It's very complicated to work in a territorial way, no? And we need to work on these changes in our country, but probably we need more time and more knowledge because it is not easy. I know, for example, that in Canada it's easier because it's a federal country. That's right, no? And the states have autonomy to decide about its budget and its plans. Here in Colombia and most of the Latin American countries, probably Mexico and Brazil, we are centralized governments, and it's very, very complicated to advance in that. We said that in Spanish. I don't know how to say that in English. Delegation is to give the power and the budget to the territories to decide what to do. No, we don't have any achievement of that.
Thank you. Others, questions? I see we have some thank yous to Angela coming through the chat there.
Spanish, thanks. Gracias.
There is a question from Verena that I'll read out. It says, as you move towards more integration and linkages, how does the legacy of large land ownership affect your efforts?
Too much. And yeah, I am preparing a conference for the next week in terms of that, because probably an analysis is that the rural zones, particularly the most isolated zones, don't have recognized property rights. And we have, and part of the conflict in Colombia is regarding the conflicts in lands, no? We have extensive lands or properties here in Colombia without any exploitation, and the poor people and the small farmer don't have the option to participate using these lands. But the big problem here is that land ownership is a way to have control of two types of markets that are very important. The labor market, because if one person have the control of the territory in terms of the ownership of the land, this person can pressure the wage to low wage, particularly for farmers. And it's a way to control the market, no? And the other issue is to have territorial control in terms of political issues. Could you imagine that we can find here in Colombia some territories that one person have 50% of the state or department, as we said, that is very, very complicated, and we don't have the capacity or the options to have a better behavior on that, because it is not clear who is the owner. We need to work on that. That was one of the point of the rural reform in the peace agreement, and we need to advance in cadastre, but also in the distribution, in the land distribution process.
Thank you. Other questions?
Yes, I have a question, Sarah. Angela, thank you very much for this presentation. And my question is in relation, well, it was not mentioned in the presentation, but what is the role of indigenous populations in territorial approaches?
Okay, yes, and you told me that, okay, here I will say, first of all, in the case of Latin America, and then a small mention of Colombian case. You know that that is a condition, a characteristic that are not well recognized in policy instruments. And the thing here is that we have like two scenarios. One scenario is related to the land ownership, that in the case of indigenous people, they are requesting for the recognition of collective land ownership. That is very important. And the other issue is is correct to say intercultural conflict that are in the rural territories between farmers, between big companies or agri-food companies, and the indigenous people that are in that lands. I think that, for example, in the case of Chile, they are working on that and recognizing the presence of the indigenous people and their relation with that territory. In the case in Colombia, we have from the new constitutions of 1991, we make a constitutional recognition of indigenous people or in Colombia. They are like territorial governments or territorial authorities, and we recognize the collective ownership of the land. I think that is a big effort, but even that, Sylvia, the indigenous people are the worst, are in the worst conditions in territorial zones. In terms of poverty, in terms of education, and in terms of health conditions. I'm not happy to say that, but in some rural zones in Colombia, many indigenous people are facing, how do you say, hambruna? They don't have food, and they are facing this complicated situation because the children are dying now at this moment, no? And the second is that they are in the conflict zones, and they are giving a fight, trying to protect their territory, particularly in the forest zones, between cattle, the extension cattle, that is a big problem here in Colombia. And the other issue is regarding the conflict, the illicit crops, Sylvia, because it is like a paradox, because it's probably the only opportunity in these zones, but they recognize, particularly the indigenous people recognize that it is a big risk to involve in this kind of activities. And you know that many of the last deaths in our country in the last weeks are indigenous people. And they are in a very in a risky situation. And I think, and that is Angela Penagos saying that the government is not paying attention to that situation. They need protection. They need the assistance of territorial and national government to protect their lands, the culture, and the possibility to integrate to the Colombian or nation development. Probably we can do a conversation about how is the conditions of indigenous people, because I think that is very, very important.
Still have a few minutes. I know we've lost a few folks who have to prep for meetings or classes from some of the students, but there's definitely a few more minutes if anyone else has any questions.
No.
Did you have a question?
Okay. No. I really, I don't know. I want to understand how is the rural development in Canada, for example. For me, it could be a good idea because I think you have made great efforts and have changed the reality of the rural zones. I know that our contexts are very different. No? Canada is a developed country, but I know some learnings and some pilots or some instruments could be a good idea for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could definitely organize probably a chat offline to talk about these things. I think there's so much that we could chat about, and others on the line as well that could likely share some of those experiences from Canada and some of the challenges and definitely inequality as well that we have here, because it's definitely not something that's balanced and fair across every rural community.
Yes. And also the cooperative system in Canada, I know that is very, very strong, and I want to learn about that.
Have lots of opportunities. We can make this.
I hope so. Okay.
Maybe
no more questions.
I see Ryan may be unmuted. I don't want to put pressure on anybody. And
hi, Ryan.
I see another unmute, so I'll stop talking.
Hi, Angela. It's great to have your presentation. It was really insightful. And I can follow up by email with some information around Canadian cooperatives, particularly related to rural development, but also some of the Canadian experiences with territorial development strategies, which have kind of gone up and down over time. And depending on where you are in the country, some of those have been very positive experiences, and some of them have been very positive but short-lived experiences as well. So happy to share that, and we can chat at any time.
Thank you. Great.
Hi there. I had a question. I thought it was interesting that you mentioned the effect on women with the loss of men, like post-war. And I was thinking about, because I'm actually originally from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and what happened post World War II is that with a lot of young, like Māori men, that took out a huge amount of the population, and then there was a lot of land loss as a result of that by taking out a section of the population that would have usually worked the land. And so because of that, there was a lot of land loss through, well, direct government interventions, but things that happened. And I was interested about the parallels there, because it makes the woman particularly vulnerable in terms of land loss, particularly if there isn't clearly defined land ownership as well. And I was interested about, you know, what kind of approaches could be taken to try and ensure that land ownership, which is not recognized, stays with women in this community if they've lost a huge amount of, like, the source of labor or protection or things like that in those rural communities.
Okay, good question. Yes. Okay, after the peace agreement, one of the point of the peace agreement is to face this problem of land ownership from the side of supply. What does it mean? In Colombia, when a person wanted to clarify his ownership, land ownership, this person must go to the institution, the land institution, say, this land is my land, and I want to clarify that. It was on the demand side, okay? And this possibility, nobody has this possibility in the rural and isolated zones. So in the peace agreement, this approach changed to the supply side, it's correct to say. And the government take the initiative or must take the initiative to go to that territories and organize all the territory and clarify all the property rights, and to have like big agreement on that. We know that it could change in the future, but that all people know that this is my land. I'm focusing in women, particularly, and poor people and small farmers. That is the idea, okay? But the problem here in Colombia is that for that we need a cadastre. And the cadastre in Colombia is in the big cities, no? In Bogotá and Cali, Medellín, but not in rural zones. And we need for that strong institutional capacity and big budgets. So the first effort, and fortunately this government is working on the cadastre. First, we need to know how are the territory and the territory and the ownership, and then give the property rights and clarify the problems. What are the other problems here? That the property rights or the procedure related to property rights and the cadastre are not in the same organization or institution. I know that is very particular in Colombia. So the organization that verify that one person is the ownership is the Justice Ministry, probably. And the institution that give land to the poor people and to farmers are the Ministry of Agriculture, and the institution that is in charge of the cadastre now is the Finance Ministry. Can you imagine how is the effort we need to coordinate these institutions, and they have a plan to go to the territory? We have just one case in Colombia, and I can give you the information. Is the case of Ovejas. It's a small town in the north of Colombia. And
sorry, can you spell that for me?
I will write in the chat.
Oh, perfect.
Ovejas. It's like it's a small town in the north of Colombia, and it's the first pilot. And it was with the international cooperation of USAID. And the government is trying now to go to other territories, but it's very, very complicated. And with the COVID issue, but I think in the future we need to advance on that. And now we have international credit with the World Bank for the cadastre. And the cadastre will focus on these territories that are isolated, weak institutional capacities. And this is part of the peace agreement. But after the cadastre, we need to work on land ownership. And I think, in my opinion, the institution that is in charge of that do not have the capacity to do that in the whole territory.
So it's not just a matter of finances. So there is a potential for the funds for that, but because of the disparate institutions, and I mean, they need the motivation to actually do it beyond just sourcing funding too.
Because and as I said after the end of the first intervention, is that the land territorial control has two purposes, no? One, to pressure the labor market, and the other, the territorial control. And when you clarify the land ownership, that means probably that some people or some elites in the rural zone will lose the control, and they have incentive not to do that, and to pressure the government to exclude this activity of the task in terms of the peace agreement. Very good. I can give you more information if you want. Please, I will share my email. I want to work on that. Probably in the Andes University, I will have a line of land and governance.
Thank you. That was really interesting.
Great, thanks.
So I'm just seeing the time, and so I know we're just after 1 o'clock, but this was fantastic, Angela, and I really learned a lot from it. I appreciate you giving up your time today to join us here, and we look forward to what comes from your research and your work. So I'll give a round of applause on behalf of everybody. It's a little different.
Oh, thanks. I really appreciate this invitation, and I hope to have more connection with you in the future.
There's lots of opportunity for sure for that. So thank you again.
Okay. See you. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye. Thanks, Silvia.
Thank you, Angela. Muchas gracias. Ya vas a estar conectado con Ryan, con Sara y con algunos estudiantes, así que ya, como hemos dicho, hay que trabajar juntos.
Bueno, muy bien. Muchas gracias. Adiós.
Chao, Ángela. Thank you, Sara. Thank you.